Here's a good test to see where you're at in your journey to B1 German. How good are you at constructing relative clauses? Das sind die Relativsätze, die man braucht, um Sätze zu bauen, die authentisch klingen und viel aussagen. And to come up with authentic and accurate sounding relative clauses, you need to know all sorts of things. Genders and the articles that go with them. You need to know cases and the articles that go with them, and the use of subordinating conjunctions. All of these are things that we have come across at either the A1 or even the A2 level. But now at B1 level and above, we are trying to use them all at the same time. Grüß Gott, hallo, ich bin Billy Badger und das ist ohnehin Baustein 3. Herzlich willkommen. You already know what these relative clauses are, I'm sure. Das sind unsere Relativsätze. They're signaled by seemingly random articles floating around in our sentences without any recognizable noun in sight. Like these here, where they often follow a comma. And then there is really no noun that's close by. And you probably know what they do. They give us more information about something that we've just been talking about. And even that sentence uses relative clauses. In English, we introduce them with words like that, which, or who. But in German, we need to be more aware of genders and cases. So let's take a simple example before we get to more complex examples later on. Now stick around because I've got four different levels of complexity coming your way. So, Level 1. Das ist der Mann, der auch gestern da war. That's the man who was here yesterday too. It's easy to see what's happening here. Here, der refers back to something in the last clause. In fact, the man. And since the man is a masculine noun, I'm using der to continue talking about him, to say that he was here yesterday too. Two clauses in the one sentence. The second one just giving us a little bit more information about some element in the first clause. And it's easy to see why it's der, isn't it? Because the same thing is happening here as well. Das ist die Frau, die auch gestern da war. Die, because the woman is a feminine noun. Das ist das Kind, das auch gestern da war. Das, because the child is a neuter noun. If we look at these relative clauses, we see that the relative pronoun, also der, die, or das, is the subject of the sentence. It's like saying, der war gestern da, die war gestern da, das war gestern da. But this is not always the case. So this is level 2. Here's what I mean. Das ist der Mann, den ich auch gestern gesehen habe. I'm still giving you more information about the man that we met in the first clause, but now he's the accusative object of my second clause because I now am the subject and I saw him. So we need to use our accusative articles, den, die, das, rather than der, die, das. This is still quite easy because the rest of our articles are exactly the same as in our Level 1 examples. Das ist die Frau, die ich auch gestern gesehen habe. Or das ist das Kind, das ich auch gestern gesehen habe. But where it gets tricky is in examples like this in Level 3. Das ist der Mann, von dem ich dir gestern erzählt habe. Das ist die Frau, von der ich dir gestern erzählt habe. Das ist das Kind, von dem ich dir gestern erzählt habe. And this is quite a bit different to the way that we do things like this in English, where we'd be saying, that's the man I told you about yesterday. So we have to break this up into two ideas. First of all, that's the man, das ist der Mann. I told you about him yesterday. Ich habe dir gestern von ihm erzählt. So to do this, we need to reorder things, don't we? das ist der Mann. And instead of saying, ich habe dir gestern von ihm erzählt, my second clause will start with not von ihm, but von dem. Das ist der Mann, von dem ich dir gestern erzählt habe. I'm just using normal articles. And that's what we'd also say with our other examples. Das ist die Frau, von der ich gestern das Buch bekommen habe. Or das ist das Kind, mit dem unser Sohn spielt. We're just using the dative articles, or I guess relative pronouns as they're being called here, because the prepositions von and mit require us to use the dative. Now, sometimes it might be in the accusative, of course, depending on the preposition that we're using. Das ist der Bus, auf den wir gewartet haben. Das ist die Party, auf die wir uns am meisten gefreut haben. Das ist das Geschenk, über das ich mich am meisten gefreut habe. So we need to know quite a bit, don't we? We need to know articles, cases, genders, prepositions, and so on. So let's move on now to more complex ideas. If you read my last Substack post, then you'll know that up until recently, I worked at a university teaching German and writing research articles and books mostly about German poetry, music, and art. And if you look at a random page in one of my essays, you can see that quite a few of the sentences are in fact relative clauses. So in more advanced writing tasks, you'll be using a lot of them. And we introduced some fancy verbs in the last post as well. So here are some examples that use those more complex verbs that we introduced. Das Problem, mit dem wir uns auseinandersetzen müssen, ist sehr komplex. Here you can see that we've embedded the relative clause in our main clause. It's not at the end, but in the middle. We're using the reflexive verb sich auseinandersetzen to indicate that this is a problem that we need to get our heads around. It's used with the dative preposition mit. We're using the relative pronoun dem because the noun that we're referring to, das Problem, is neuter. Here the commas are pretty important, aren't they? Because they help us to understand the structure of the sentence and where those verbs are meant to go. Let's try another. Die Tradition, auf die wir hier zurückgreifen, ist eine sehr lange. Again, we've embedded the relative clause using the verb zurückgreifen to indicate that we're harking back to an older tradition, appealing, if you like, to a tradition. Our verb uses the preposition auf with the accusative. So that's why we are starting our relative clause with auf die. Let's use a new compound verb, den Kopf zerbrechen, which means to rack your brains, or even to some extent to agonize or worry about. We've got some dative and the preposition über, which gets used with the accusative here. So I can say, das Problem, über das ich mir den Kopf zerbrochen habe, hat sich inzwischen gelegt. And what I'm trying to say here is the problem that I've been worrying about or agonizing over has resolved itself. We're using the dative in much the same way that you would use it if you're saying you were, for example, washing your hands. Ich wasche mir die Hände. Here we're breaking our heads, so ich zerbreche mir den Kopf. What about? Über das Problem. So it is, in fact, quite a complex structure. Let's get another example so we can introduce another verb, one of my favorites, verfügen. Now, this is a great verb. It sounds quite fancy, but is in reality really quite simple. Here's something we might read. Die Archive, über die das Museum verfügt, in denen die Originale lagern, sind jetzt auch digital zugänglich. You can see I'm using two relative clauses signaled by these articles. Die, that's our first one, and then denen, that's our second one. And this is the only relative pronoun that's not just a normal definite article. This is our dative plural. Let's see what's happening. Our main clause is simply this. Die Archive sind jetzt auch digital zugänglich. So nice to know our archives are now also available digitally. Which archives? That's what our relative clause tells us. Die Archive, über die das Museum verfügt. That's our new verb verfügen, which essentially means just to have or to have at one's disposal. So we're saying the archives that we have at our disposal. And then you'll see this clause, in denen die Originale lagern. Again, we're giving more information about the archive, another relative clause. These are the archives where the originals are stored. In denen die Originale lagern. And you might know the noun das Lager is a kind of beer that's traditionally stored in a Lagerhaus, a storeroom. So lagern is the verb to store. Okay, so we can pile these all up, linking them together to provide lots of information in a compact way. Now, if you follow this channel a bit, then you'll know that there have been some changes recently. Here's what's going on. Die Uni, an der ich länger als 20 Jahre gearbeitet habe, hat mich vor ein paar Wochen entlassen. Das Fach, das ich unterrichtet habe, haben sie einfach gestrichen. Den Computer, mit dem ich die Videos geschnitten habe, musste ich zurückgeben. Das ist das Problem, mit dem ich mich nun auseinandersetzen muss. Wie man hier sieht, sind unsere Relativsätze, die wir vielleicht schon kannten und über die wir in diesem Video viel gesprochen haben, ein wesentlicher Bestandteil einer Sprache, die komplexere Informationen preisgibt. Und somit setze ich diesem Video ein Ende. Danke fürs Zuschauen, alles Gute und tschüss!
Ziemlich kompliziert.